We all remember the thrill of a perfectly directed action sequence, that seamless moment when chaos, precision, and art collide. A car flips, a man dives through fire, the camera moves like it knows the rhythm of danger itself. We celebrate the director, the visionary behind the lens, the one whose name flashes before the end credits like a badge of honor. But what if that name doesn't belong to the person who truly made the film? Hollywood's history is filled with ghosts, directors erased from their own creations, replaced in silence, and buried under contractual secrecy. Sometimes, the original vision was deemed too dark, too strange, or simply too expensive. Other times, it was the studio's panic that led to a quiet coup behind the scenes. Another filmmaker would be brought in, sometimes weeks before release, to reshoot, re-edit, and reshape an entire story. Yet when the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, only one name appeared, the wrong one. These aren't mere creative disagreements, they're acts of cinematic surgery. Scenes torn apart, entire performances reshot, explosions filmed again to match a new tone. The public never knew, the unions kept quiet, and the people who actually pulled the trigger behind the camera never saw their names on the poster. In this episode, we're peeling back that layer of denial, 15 action films where the credited director wasn't the one who truly called action. Some of them were nearly ruined, others secretly improved, but all share the same haunting mystery. Who really directed what you saw? Let's dive into 15 action movies reshaped, rewritten, and reimagined by someone who was never supposed to exist. Fact has shown Superman 2, 1980. Few stories define creative takeover like Superman do. Director Richard Donner, fresh off the success of the first film, had already shot nearly 75% of the sequel when producers abruptly replaced him with Richard Lester. Donner's vision was grand, mythic, and serious. Lester's was playful and comedic. The studio ordered major reshoots, altering tone, dialogue, and even entire endings. When Superman 2 premiered, audiences had no idea they were watching a film stitched from two opposing visions. For decades, Donner's footage was thought lost until 2006, when the Richard Donner cut finally surfaced, revealing a completely different, darker, and more emotionally resonant version. It was a rare act of cinematic redemption, the truth of authorship restored long after the battle was lost. Fact #2, The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1996. If chaos had a face, it would look like The Island of Dr. Moreau. The production began under Richard Stanley, a visionary filmmaker with a surreal, gothic touch. Days into shooting, Stanley clashed violently with studio executives and lead actor Val Kilmer. He was fired and replaced by John Frankenheimer, a Hollywood veteran known for control, not creativity. The transition was catastrophic. Scripts changed daily, scenes were rewritten on set, and actors refused direction. Stanley, humiliated, disappeared into the Australian jungle only to sneak back onto the set disguised as an extra in a monster suit. The final film was an incoherent fever dream of egos and mismanagement. It bombed spectacularly, but its legend lives on as one of cinema's greatest behind-the-scenes nightmares. A movie directed by two men and destroyed by both. Fact #3, Tomb Raider, The Cradle of Life, 2003. After the success of the first Tomb Raider, Paramount wanted a sequel that was louder, faster, and packed with spectacle. Director Jan de Bont envisioned something darker, a world-weary Lara Croft, facing moral choices rather than just exotic traps. But once filming began, the studio panicked. Test audiences wanted more explosions, not emotion. The second unit, originally assigned to stunts, was suddenly tasked with reshooting large chunks of the film's action scenes. De Bont's carefully choreographed sequences were replaced with flashier, faster edits. Crew members described the shoot as two films colliding in real time. When the final cut premiered, de Bont barely recognized his own movie. The result looked polished but soulless, a blockbuster built by committee, where every explosion buried the story a little deeper. Fact #4, Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, 2016. While credited solely to Gareth Edwards, Rogue One was quietly reimagined in the editing room. After early test screenings revealed pacing issues, Lucasfilm hired Tony Gilroy, screenwriter of The Bourne Identity, to oversee reshoots and restructure the final act. Gilroy added new scenes, rewrote dialogue, and crafted the now iconic Darth Vader corridor sequence. Insiders claim his influence shaped nearly one-third of the movie. though he never received directorial credit. Edwards, known for his restrained, human-centered storytelling, accepted the final version but later admitted it changed beyond recognition. Ironically, the reshaped Rogue One became one of the most acclaimed modern Star Wars films, proof that even invisible hands can craft legends. 2 directors, 1 victory, and 1 silent ghost in the credits. Fact #5, The Wolfman, 2010. The Wolfman began as a moody, atmospheric horror film under the direction of Mark Romanek, known for his meticulous, artful style. But when Romanek clashed with Universal over budget and tone, he was replaced just weeks before shooting by Joe Johnston, a director known for brisk, traditional storytelling. The swap left scars on the production. Massive sets stood unused while Johnston rushed to meet the release schedule. Visual effects were reworked multiple times, and composers were replaced mid-production. The final cut felt torn between gothic beauty and mainstream spectacle. Romanek's fingerprints linger only in the misty, melancholic opening. Everything else, the pacing, the tone, the monster itself, belonged to someone else. The Wolfman became less a horror film and more a warning. When 2 directors fight over a beast, the monster is the movie itself. Fact #10, Justice League, 2017. When tragedy struck Zack Snyder's family during the post-production of Justice League, he stepped down from the project. What followed was one of Hollywood's most infamous replacements. Warner Brothers hired Joss Whedon, the man behind The Avengers, to finish the film. But Whedon didn't just complete Snyder's work, he transformed it. Entire sequences were reshot. Jokes were added, color palettes brightened, and the tone shifted from mythic to sarcastic. Nearly 80 new pages of script were written. The result was a Frankenstein blockbuster, 2 visions stitched together under 1 logo. Fans noticed. They demanded the original version, the Snyder Cut. Years later, HBO Max finally released Snyder's true vision, proving how drastically one film can change when a new director inherits another's dream. Justice League remains the ultimate example of what happens when power, grief, and studio control collide. Fact #7 Solo, A Star Wars Story, 2018. Even the galaxy far, far away isn't immune to behind-the-scenes mutiny. Halfway through production, directors Phil Lord and Chris Miller, known for their irreverent, comedic tone, were fired from Solo for deviating from Lucasfilm's vision. Enter Ron Howard, the safe pair of hands. By the time he finished, nearly 70% of the film had been reshot, making Solo one of the most expensive Star Wars projects ever made. Lord and Miller's fingerprints, the humor, the chaos, the unpredictability were erased. What remained was a polished, calculated adventure. Critics called it competent but soulless. In the end, Solo became the cinematic equivalent of a smuggler without identity, built by rebels, claimed by the Empire. Fact #8 American History X, 1998. Tony Kaye's American History X isn't a pure action movie, but its production was a war zone. The film's brutal intensity came from Kaye's raw vision. But when lead actor Edward Norton saw the rough cut, he believed it needed more emotional depth. He personally supervised a re-edit, adding 24 minutes of footage and reshaping the story's tone. The studio sided with Norton. Kaye, furious, disowned the film and petitioned to have his name removed, even proposing to be credited as Humpty Dumpty. His request was denied. The version the world saw was Norton's cut, not Kaye's. Ironically, the film went on to be hailed as a masterpiece, earning Norton an Oscar nomination. But Kaye never directed another Hollywood film again. His creation lived, but his career didn't. Fact #9 Exorcist, The Beginning, 2004. Few films in modern cinema history have endured a resurrection as brutal as Exorcist, The Beginning. Originally helmed by Paul Schrader, the film was conceived as a psychological descent into faith and madness, quiet, cerebral, and unsettling. But the studio hated it. They demanded more blood, more screams, more horror. Schrader refused. He was fired, and Rennie Harlin, known for explosive action films like Die Hard 2, was hired to reshoot nearly the entire movie, about 90% of it. The result was a louder, bloodier, completely different story. Schrader's original version was buried, unreleased, until fans demanded to see it years later under the title Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. Watching both cuts back-to-back is like watching 2 directors fight for the same soul, one with dread, the other with dynamite. Fact #0 Supernova, 2000. No film represents creative chaos better than Supernova. Originally directed by Walter Hill, the space horror project was plagued by reshoots, re-edits, and executive panic. After Hill's departure, Jack Sholder was brought in to overhaul the tone, turning a slow-burn thriller into a glossy sci-fi adventure. But even that wasn't enough. MGM, desperate to salvage its investment, later invited Francis Ford Coppola to quietly advise in post-production, adjusting scenes and color grading. In the end, the film credited Walter Hill, but he had already used the infamous alias Thomas Lee to distance himself. Supernova became a black hole of clashing egos, 3 directors, 1 film, and no survivors. It stands today as a warning to every filmmaker. Sometimes the most dangerous explosion happens in the editing room. Fact Hassonen Intent to Kill, 1992. Intent to Kill might be one of the strangest production tales of the early 90 seconds. 2 directors, 2 visions, and 1 confused film. One was hired for the story, a gritty police thriller, while the other specialized in action choreography. They worked separately, shooting scenes in isolation, sometimes without knowing what the other had filmed. In the end, producers had to assemble both halves into something coherent. The final cut feels disjointed. Character arcs end abruptly, gunfights appear without build-up, and tone shifts mid-scene. Officially, only 1 director was credited, but insiders have confirmed that nearly half the movie came from a second pair of hands. Watching it now feels like glimpsing a cinematic tug-of-war, 2 filmmakers battling for a movie neither would ever truly own. Fact Hassonen Intent to Kill, 1992. Intent to Kill might be one of the strangest production tales of the early 90 seconds. 2 directors, 2 visions, and 1 confused film. One was hired for the story, a gritty police thriller, while the other specialized in action choreography. They worked separately, shooting scenes in isolation, sometimes without knowing what the other had filmed. In the end, producers had to assemble both halves into something coherent. The final cut feels disjointed. Character arcs end abruptly, gunfights appear without build-up, and tone shifts mid-scene. Officially, only 1 director was credited, but insiders have confirmed that nearly half the movie came from a second pair of hands. Watching it now feels like glimpsing a cinematic tug-of-war, 2 filmmakers battling for a movie neither would ever truly own. Fact Hassonen 3 Hard Justice, 1995. Hard Justice was supposed to be a straightforward DTV martial arts flick, but what unfolded behind the scenes could fill an entire documentary. Principal photography began under Greg Yaitanes, but creative clashes between producers and the director quickly spiraled out of control. By week 4, Yaitanes was gone, replaced unofficially by a second unit that took over the action scenes without any public announcement. Entire fight sequences were restaged to increase violence and pacing, while the story was re-edited into incoherence. No one ever officially acknowledged the change. Yaitanes' name stayed in the credits, but insiders knew most of the final footage wasn't his. Watching Hard Justice today feels like watching 2 films stitched together, one with intent, the other with desperation. Entire fight sequences were restaged to increase violence and pacing, while the story was re-edited into incoherence. No one ever officially acknowledged the change. Yaitanes' name stayed in the credits, but insiders knew most of the final footage wasn't his. Watching Hard Justice today feels like watching 2 films stitched together, one with intent, the other with desperation. Nearly half of the action scenes were reshot explosions, bigger, blood thicker, dialogue trimmed. When the final cut arrived, the tone had shifted completely. What began as a somber revenge drama turned into a B-grade spectacle. No one ever admitted who directed the finished film. Even the crew avoided interviews. The result? A movie that feels like 2 voices fighting for control, one searching for depth, the other screaming for noise. Fact 105. Catchfire, 1990. When Catchfire hit theaters in 1990, few noticed the strange name in the credits, Alan Smithee. To most viewers, it was just another obscure action thriller starring Dennis Hopper and Jodie Foster. But inside Hollywood, Alan Smithee was code. It meant one thing. A director had disowned his own film. Hopper had started Catchfire as both star and director, but midway through editing, the studio took control. They ordered reshoots, recut entire sequences, and softened the tone to make it more commercial. Furious, Hopper walked away and refused to have his name attached. The final film bore traces of 2 visions, the artists and the corporations colliding in every frame. Even today, the Alan Smithee label on Catchfire stands as a quiet confession of betrayal. It wasn't just a bad movie, it was a stolen one. Bonus fact: Blade. Trinity, 2004. On paper, Blade. Trinity should have been the perfect conclusion to one of the most stylish action trilogies of its era. But behind the camera, it descended into chaos. Director David S. Goyer, who had written the first two films, took over directing duties for the third. Star Wesley Snipes, unhappy with the new tone and direction, reportedly refused to communicate with Goyer, speaking to him only through handwritten notes signed, "From Blade." Crew members described a divided set where Snipes stayed in character off-camera, avoided eye contact with castmates, and once tried to strangle Goyer during an argument. To salvage the production, Goyer secretly handed control of several action sequences to his second unit uncredited directors, who reshot entire scenes, while the lead actor remained isolated in his trailer. By post-production, the film was being edited in fragments, with multiple editors and stunt coordinators piecing together what little footage they had. When Blade, Trinity hit theaters, critics called it incoherent, but few realized why. It wasn't the work of one director, it was the shattered remains of several, stitched together under one name. Years later, both Goyer and Snipes admitted the production had fallen apart from the inside. It was a fitting metaphor for a movie about vampires, a story drained of its lifeblood before the cameras even stopped rolling. So now you've seen them, the 15 action films that were never truly directed by the names you know. Each one carries a secret signature, buried under studio edits, politics, and ego. But maybe that's the real story of Hollywood. Every movie is a battlefield, and not every victor gets their name engraved on the credits. Which version would you rather see, the one the studio approved, or the one they tried to hide? Tell us in the comments. How much of a movie belongs to its director when the real author never made it to the screen?